Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at OneElect, and today we're going to be looking at Azure B2C and how you can integrate that with an application. Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about Azure AD B2C. Now typically when we think about Azure AD on Azure, we're thinking about the Azure AD experience where you have your organization using Azure AD and your users are in your AD tenant, and that allows them to log into Azure and maybe some of your applications you have configured to use that tenant. It also supports another scenario we call B2B, and we've already covered this, where you can do things like federation against external identity stores that are more enterprise oriented, such as Azure Active Directory federated services if you're running an on-premise solution, or you can use it with other Azure Active Directory tenants as well to allow external users into your application. Now, what Azure B2C is oriented towards is consumer-oriented applications. So this would be if you're selling something like software as a service and you want to have individual user accounts that are being used for authentication, and you don't want to maintain a bunch of user accounts inside of your application. So what Azure B2C allows you to do is have a business to consumer model where you can take advantage of many of the online identity stores that already exist, such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, and so on. And all of these user accounts already exist, and many users have social media where they log in and then they are posting there, and they use those social media logins for other applications online as well. What Azure B2C allows you to do is leverage those and then kind of aggregate those into a single system that you can then use to connect to your application without having to configure every single one of those for your application to use. So we're going to look at this from the side of an application today. We're going to run through a quick setup, and then we're going to show you how to integrate it with an application. We're going to do a couple of videos on this where we're going to be looking at how you can integrate it with things like Facebook and other identity providers, and then look at it from the idea of building out policies and things like that. So it's a multi-part series in Azure B2C. OneElect also has some very in-depth training on this, which I'm going to point you to if you're interested in it, but we'll be covering some of the basics here over a couple of videos. Before we go over to the Azure portal, I want to talk about the login experience for an application. So I have an application and I want to log in. So I go onto my application, and the first thing that the application is going to look for is some kind of cookie or token that identifies the user. If it doesn't find one, it's going to force them over to Azure B2C. And Azure B2C is going to have associated with that application some kind of scheme to allow it to log into something. And that's typically done by way of a policy that is configured in Azure B2C. And then my application tells Azure B2C which policy I want to use. The policy is basically going to configure Azure B2C to use one of the many available identity providers that Azure AD B2C supports. And one of those is an internal identity provider that allows you just to collect the email and username right there inside of Azure B2C without going to an external identity provider, or you can configure it to use something like Twitter or Facebook, which are fairly straightforward. So once you have the application redirect over to Azure B2C, you get redirected over to the login page for whatever identity provider the user chooses. So that could be one of many ones that you configure in your application. If you only want to support one, you can do that. But typically the advantage of using something like B2C is it allows you to configure multiple identity providers such as Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And you would go over to that login page and type in your credentials there. Or if you've already logged in, you would basically authorize the application to read your profile. And so what happens then is one of these identity providers, Twitter, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, whoever it may be, provides some kind of claims about the user. Now, claims are basically just properties. These are things like name, first name, last name, email address, and maybe where you live or something like that, depending on what you request from the identity provider, and also what the user is willing to provide back to your application based on the privacy settings, etc., that you might be asking for. So once that data is provided from the identity provider, it goes back to Azure B2C, and then Azure B2C then puts that back into basically a user store in Azure B2C, but it doesn't store the password. It only stores some basic user information about the user. It's not storing the password. That's all done by the identity provider. And once that's stored, then what it does is it creates a standard token then that it takes and sends back over to your application. Now, the one advantage of doing it this way is because Azure B2C is going to present your application with a standard token that it can read for those user properties without having to create a separate login scheme within the application for each one of the identity providers that you choose to support. So this can actually help simplify a lot of your application developments because Azure B2C takes a lot of that headache away from you. In any case, let's go over the Azure portal and take a look at how to set up Azure B2C, and then we'll look at some code, and then we'll run a little demo on how that code interacts with Azure B2C. So I'm here in the Azure portal, and the first thing I want to do to set up Azure B2C is make sure that I have the provider available inside of the subscription I want to use. So to do that, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to pick subscriptions. And now to enable this, I just basically want to go into one of these subscriptions here and then click on it, and whichever one you want to target for your B2C tenant. And then you want to scroll down to resource providers, and then you want to look for Active Directory. Just type in Active Directory right here. It's called Microsoft Azure Active Directory right here. And this is what you want to register. So you basically want to click register if it's not enabled. I've already done it on this subscription. Let's see if I can find another one here and see if I have it enabled on another one, Active Directory. This one, it's not registered. So if I wanted it enabled, Azure Active Directory B2C on this subscription, I would need to select this and click register right there. And then that will enable it for this particular subscription. So once I have it registered, and after I've clicked registered, it might take about 5 to 10 minutes to register. And after I have the provider registered, I'm ready to set up an Azure B2C tenant. So you can close that out. And then to create a new one, you just create a resource, and then you can just type in B2C. And then you have Azure Active Directory B2C. And this is going to walk you through a wizard to basically create this just like you would for any other Azure resource, Azure B2C. Now you can use an existing one or you can create a new tenant. Now the tenant that you'll need to do then is set up some of the configuration here. Basically, what's the domain that you're going to be using this for? So you type in that and you type in Blaze Demo or something like that, and then you would select the subscription that you enabled it for, and then you want to pick a resource group, and it's going to put it into a resource group, and then you would go to create and create it. And once it creates, missing a feature, I'm missing something here. Name is not valid. Blaze Demo. If I wanted to create this, I'm not going to actually create this since I've already done this. And once the validation passes, you click create, and it'll take about 10 minutes to create your new Azure AD B2C tenant on Microsoft Azure under the subscription that you chose. So once that's done, then you can come back over to your resource group or your resources and find the actual B2C tenant that you created. Mine's right here. I called it Blaze B2C Demo right here. And that's the tenant I'm going to log into. And this is the one that I'm interested in using for my demo today. So let's go and look at how to do an app registration and how to set up a basic policy for login now. Okay, I'm going to go over to my Azure B2C tenant here. I'm simply going to click on the icon there, and it's going to kick me over to a login. So what I'm basically doing is logging into a brand new tenant on Azure. So this is not the same tenant I was using because this is an Azure AD tenant. I actually have the ability to create resources against this tenant now. I'm looking at an Azure B2C tenant that would allow me to create things like SQL databases, app services, and virtual machines, but the access controls for these aren't managed by the actual subscription AD that I used when I created this Azure B2C tenant. So this is a completely new set of users that I'm going to be using here. But that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what I can do right here inside of Azure B2C to create things like logins for my application. So what I'm going to do here then is create two things. I'm going to create a user flow as a policy, and then I'm going to create an app registration. And that's what I need to make this thing work with a particular user flow. So I'm going to come down here to policies and click on user flow. And under this, I already have one created. I'm going to create a new one right here to show you what this looks like. So I can choose a number of different user flows. Basically, user flows are journeys through Azure B2C, if you will. So you have the different things you can do on this. So sign up and sign on would be the most common one that you'd want to use this for. But you can also do profile editing, password resets, sign up, sign in as separate flows, or you can use resource owner password credentials right there. I'm going to use this one right here and create a user flow right here. And then I can use a version of this. I'm just going to click the recommended one here. And then I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it demo policy and policy 2. And then I'm going to choose email sign up right here. And I can choose MFA if I want to. Email MFA would be fine. And then a conditional enforcement of that. Now here's where I'm going to choose the claims I want to use. And so I'm going to choose the claims that I'm interested in for like given name and surname as first name and last name, and then the email address. And I'm going to click create. And so what this will do is basically whenever I set this policy up, I'm going to be asking the user to log in with their email address on Azure B2C instead of using an external identity provider, which you're going to cover that in another video. So basically, I just set up a policy that will say use a login with an email address and a password that's going to be tracked by Azure AD B2C instead of an external identity provider, which we'll talk about in a future video. So once I have that ready to go, I now have my policy set up, and now I can use this inside of my application. I already have one set up. It's basically the same thing that I have there. So if I wanted to edit it, I could definitely go back in and use these as well. But I already set it up, so I'm ready to go as far as the policy is concerned. Now to do the next step, which is an app registration, I'm going to click on app registrations right here. Now I already have one set up for the app that I'm going to be working with whenever I go over to Visual Studio. I've already set this one up, but I'm going to create a new registration here. And this is basically like you would do inside of Azure AD, not just the B2C tenant. It's kind of very similar to that. So I can go Blaze app 1 or something like that. And then you can say organizational directory only. That's just for this single tenant. Or you can do multiple tenants as any Active Directory tenant, or you can use other identity providers and organizational directories. That's the one you'll want to choose for external providers like Twitter, Facebook, etc. So here I'm going to choose this as a redirect URL. I need to have this in here so that the actual B2C knows where to redirect things whenever a user does log in. And this is important because this actually gets sent by the actual application as well, but you need to have it here so that it won't redirect to just any random application. So this is a way of having a redirect URL that authenticates the app in a small way that basically says, does the redirect URI that the actual application sent to me match the list that I have inside of my Azure B2C tenant? If it doesn't match, they're going to get an error. And that is a security feature that you probably most definitely want to turn on. And then grant admin consent for OpenID, etc. for offline permissions. And then once you have that, you click on register. And the registration only takes a few seconds to do. I've already set up another app that I'm going to be using, and I'm going to come back in here and just look at a couple other things here that I turned on. And under authentication, because I'm using this local host, I registered it using a local host with a .NET OpenID Connect. That's what that is. To get this to work, I needed to enable access tokens for implicit flows and then ID tokens for implicit and hybrid flows, so that the identity gets embedded inside of a token, and so that can be used for the actual logons that I'm going to be doing. So I had to turn that on for this to work. And then once I have those two properties set, I am ready to go actually for my actual application right here. And there's some little helps that this thing can do for you, just to point some of these out. You can have integration help and assistant. And this basically just does some checks on your application to make sure that everything's configured right for specific kinds of apps if you want to so choose to use this. And you can then look at a couple of these different kinds of development, docs and tutorials for all these, and then you can do tests and release and so on underneath this integration assistant, which is very useful for debugging purposes as well. And then you can also go back and edit things inside of the app, etc., using this. So let's go over to Azure and let's go over to ASP.NET. Sorry about that. And let's look at what I did to configure my ASP.NET application in Visual Studio to use this Azure AD B2C tenant. Okay, now I'm looking at Visual Studio 2019, and I have an app already pulled up right here. So this is just a demo app that is set up for the purpose of showing the authentication integration with Azure B2C here. Now, the way to do this is pretty straightforward. There's a couple of things that you want to first set up inside your application if you're using .NET. Now, this will look different for different kinds of applications depending on whatever platform you're using, but the basic idea is the same. So you'll need the MASL libraries or MSAL libraries that Microsoft provides for integrating with Azure AD. And in .NET, you can get those through NuGet. And so I basically just set up Microsoft Identity Web and Microsoft Identity Web.UI, and you can get those just by browsing for Microsoft Identity right here. You can get those Identity Web and then .UI right here, and get those install those, and then it will be available inside of your project. Now, once that's set up, there's a couple of things you need to do to the startup just to wire it up, and you would need to do this for other things. You need to be able to get the configuration right here for OpenID Connect, and then inject that as far as the configure services in the startup. And then down here inside of the actual application, you need to add authentication and authorization to your startup here under configure right there. Now, once you have that, then you can actually integrate the decorators into your code. Now, I know I'm glossing over this pretty quickly because the point of this isn't so much about .NET, but I'm just showing you the way that this works. So this authorized header is really what is doing the secret sauce here that will force a user to log in. So if your controller has authorized at the class level, it will force an authorization or login for the entire class. If you do it at the method level, you can decorate the method with the authorize, and then it will only force authentication for a given method in your class. So that authorized tag is, or really decorator, is what's going to give you the configuration right here in your code that will tell what part of your code needs authorization and what part of your code doesn't need authorization. And then once you have all of that integrated with your code, the next thing you need to set up is your app settings. So back down here in my startup right here, notice that I have this is reading it from my app config. Essentially, it's reading a section called Azure AD, and you can call out whatever. It's just that's got to match on to whatever is in your app settings right here. And so mine is called Azure AD right here. So inside of this particular Azure AD block here is where I'm going to put in settings from my Azure B2C tenant. So the first thing I need to do is populate the instance right here, and this is going to be your tenant name. So I gave mine Blaze B2C Demo, and then you're going to put b2clogon.com. And that's going to be pretty much true for all of the tenants, Azure AD tenants right there. And then you'll also want to put in the domain right here. It's also going to be your tenant name.microsoftonline.com. So this field right here, .microsoftonline.com, is going to match the name that you have right here. The client ID is the next piece right here, which is a GUID. To get the GUID, you go over here to your tenant, and you can go to directory ID right here, or application ID to client ID, and you're going to get this GUID right here, not directory ID. You're going to copy that. That's what you need, is the client ID. And then once you have that, then you can paste that into your client ID right here, or you can memorize it and type it in if you so choose. Next, you'll need to configure the sign up, sign in policy ID. And this is the policy that I configured for Azure B2C to log in and sign up with. And that was the name of it. So if you don't remember what you named it, you can simply come over here to your policies and get those out of your user flow policies right here. And that is the one I'm using. I'm using B2C one demo policy right there. And so I can go back over here to my code and paste that in right there. That's what you need for that right there. And then you need this callback. This needs to match what you have inside of that callback URI. So sign in dash OIDC or OpenID Connect is the one that this uses. That needs to match whatever that callback URI you had inside of your callback setting inside of Azure AD. So just to quickly see where that is, that's what's outside of your app registration right here. So that needs to match whatever I put in underneath my callback URIs. So there's the URI, the redirect URI that I have. That should be the URI portion. It should be whatever after that last slash is what you put into the callback path, and it's going to prepend whatever is in the browser for the URI for this application, which is going to be localhost in this context. So once you have that, save the settings, and then if you launch your application, all should go well. So once this starts up, I'm going to get a browser here in a second, and this is going to kick me over to a login screen if it's all configured correctly. And you should see a login screen that looks like this. So if I wanted to log in, I could. If I wanted to sign up, I would go through the sign up wizard, and notice it's asking me for all the fields that I'm asked for. I need my email address for the principal, but there's the password I put in, and there's the username and the first name and last name, or the given name and surname that I have for this user. And once I click create, it'll create a user, but I need to get a verification code. That'll send me an email, and I put in a verification code, and then that just basically makes sure that the email's good. And then once that's set up, then I have a user account for this particular user on B2C. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to log in with a user already set up inside of B2C. So I'm going to type in some credentials here, and if all goes well, I should be able to log in and go back over to my application. So now I have logged into my application using Azure B2C, and this is integrated with Azure B2C using the Maso libraries. I didn't have to do hardly any configuration at all with this. So on our next week's video, we're going to build on this a little bit, and we're going to extend it to include some other identity providers such as Twitter, maybe Facebook, and if I'm feeling real ambitious, maybe I'll try Google. But at the end of the day, you can configure the built-in identity provider using an email address, and then just configure your application to use that, and it's very easy to do as well. So stay tuned for more videos in this series that we're going to be doing on Azure B2C. If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintellect.com. Until next time, thank you.